couple of structuring remarks. We have a disagreement here really about the moral content and even the religious content coming from Edward here versus Tom's very interesting pragmatism that the Dissent of Occupy is seeing the problems ahead, right? This car crash image. Walter Benjamin talks about revolution as pulling the emergency brake on the train of history when you see history, the humanity heading towards boulders on the tracks further down, right? So that's what revolution is, suddenly realizing, you know, it can't go on like this. There is no alternative. And I think perhaps one thing we're getting to here maybe is a distinction between dissent as political, which it very much was, say, in the Soviet Union or in Czechoslovakia, a resistance to governmental power, and then the dissent that perhaps is coming in movements, let's say, like Occupy, that is economic. How does one dissent actually not against governments and ideologies and regimes, but an economic system, in which case playing along with the system is not putting up Workers of the World Unite by the greengrocer, but it's going down to B&Q on a Sunday morning, right? It's just taking part in you know, being involved in, I don't know, paying your pension contributions. It's taking part in the economic system. How do you dissent against economics? How do you dissent against politics? You know, what's the question there? It's one thing I wanted to raise, and I just wonder whether maybe the ambassador, first of all, has a couple of thoughts on that. What's the difference then between Havel's morality and, say, Occupy's economic pragmatism?
Well, a couple of thoughts then. First of all, it's not about politics. And even what Havel did was not primarily about politics. Havel was a very successful playwright. He all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but because of he wrote and how he wrote it, found himself on a list, on a blacklist. He was barred from having his plays produced anywhere in the country, and he was barred from traveling outside, and eventually he became a dissident. Admittedly, his writing was of a political kind, but it's a much clearer example is the example of the musicians, the plastic people of the universe and the other rock musicians. They had no political, as far as I know, they had no political ideas at all. I mean, they just wanted to play rock and roll, and wear their hair long and do they sing, and they were quite brutally assaulted, their concerts, by the police on several instances, and again their license to play was taken away from them, etc., etc. And it was this incident that actually, as already mentioned, gave the impetus to the Charter 77. So this is the first thing. And the second thing, the independent life of a society that Tom mentioned. It's a very peculiar thing, and in Czechoslovakia in the 1980s and in Poland and in some of the other communist countries as well, it developed to almost an extreme of a separate society. I mean, in the end, by the mid-80s, the dissident movement produced its own books, its own newspapers, its own art, its own philosophy, its own schooling, its own dinners, even its own balls. You know, it's because and it became a kind of a society operating by its own rules, quite independently of the society at large. And my point is, of course, in other countries there have been such groups, and most of the time they will remain enclaves or communes, and they dissipate. But in some quite important instances, like the early Christianity, or the dissident movement in communist Eastern Europe, you know, they become eventually so independent, so self-sustaining, that one day they simply take over. And the question is whether what is happening today will be a commune or a movement.
What is happening is that we are very well connected. We have an international, network with other occupiers all over the world. Obviously, we're in touch with people in Spain and Italy and Greece. Even in some of the places where you might not expect them to be, but certainly in Mexico, obviously in New York, we know them well. So we connected in that way, and I suppose the thing is that, coming back to the point that you were making, Tim, that this is not against a singular regime with a border that limits the size of it. This is against an economic system that we feel, as you might have gathered by the 1% and 99% slogans, is malfunctioning and is not capable of dealing with the challenge of the 21st century, and which increasingly is leading to greater inequality and not serving the best interests of pretty much most people. So we operate in a different way. We won't be storming a palace, but we certainly will be writing about ways in which the system should change. I suppose we could storm the stock exchange. We tried that though, so we can't do that. But in terms of education, we in fact have written our own little book. This is called the little Book of Ideas from the Economics Working Group, and that goes into 27 commonly used terms and concepts associated with the financial crash and some of the policies that have been put in place with complicated names to try and convince people not to look any deeper to see if they work or not, which again is the language of bluff and mystery, designed to stop people getting involved and raising their hands as opposed to just us. But I would say that we are certainly operating in similar ways to previous movements, just with technology and the ability to spread knowledge in a much more efficient and global way. Then that's certainly changed things.
One thing that I've been thinking about while listening to all of the speakers is the subtitle of this, or is it the title, The Art of the Impossible, that phrase itself. Actually, before we began this session, Edward McMillan-Scott and I were talking briefly about the sort of inherent utopianism that seems to lie in that phrase. What is the point of trying to achieve the impossible? It certainly seems to go against the idea of any sort of rational or pragmatic knowledge. And yet, it has to be remembered that in the 70s, when Havel was writing these things, what he was calling for would have seemed completely impossible. Much of what is being called for, say, in China or Iran today, seems impossible. But does one engage in these activities in order to sort of bring something about that's impossible? That would seem completely idealistic. On the other hand, something that seems to have come out of so many of the speakers' comments is the fact that one does these things because there is no choice. It's not a question of saying, oh, wouldn't it be great if the world were otherwise? Let's try and bring it about. It's, as the ambassador said at the beginning, it's something that you just, it's not a choice you make. Alena said something that it's not a question of confronting power. In other words, it's not a tactical or strategic attempt to bring about particular aims necessarily. It's something that is about holding to certain values. And I wonder if that's something that we can reflect on a bit. That idea of it not even being a choice. And with what Edward was saying, the quote from Kundera at the end, perhaps that would be a cynical version that we can control the past, we can change the past, but we can't change the future. On the other hand, maybe that's also this sense of, well, what actually is possible, what is in our control, and what do we just do out of necessity, and how does that make dissent something different from politics, opposition, all of those sort of means ends types of action? I don't know if there's anything to respond to in those thoughts or not. But.
Well, I would reiterate the point that I would certainly distinguish between crisis-driven opposition and a value-oriented dissent. I think it is an important distinction to keep. I would also support the idea of pragmatism in the sense in which the systems are codependent on the dissent from them. Like take the hackers, who are constantly improving our computer security, because the more holes they find, the better security officers mend them. The same with art. The more artistic creativity explores the boundary between art and reality, the more interesting it becomes and the more questionable. I really like the points that were made about not idealizing the dissent, or indeed the opposition. We are all humans, and the natures of the system actually bring certain elements to the nature of the dissent, and they're not always ideals. I think rather than speaking about morality, I would introduce the notion of multiple moralities, that they are existing and driving the dissent movement. And the last point I wanted to make is, round about now, there were mass opposition movement that has emerged out of nowhere in Russia. In fact, they just celebrated first anniversary of the mass protests in December in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Tellingly, they did it in London. So it looks like that sort of opposition also starts reflecting upon itself, because it's one thing when there was a crisis of parliamentary elections and certain people came out in response, and 1 year later they are not so preoccupied with that. So there are fluctuation in time. That is again, something that will have to be taken into the picture.
Edward, were there things you wanted to pick up on Peter's comment, or?
Well, I was looking at Tom's rather interesting leaflet, the little book of ideas. Just one other for you is, why don't people stop eating meat, or at least so much meat? Because it's a disastrous waste of money, it's a disastrous waste of our resources, and it's very polluting. And I'm surprised you haven't picked it up, but anyway, there it is. I stopped 3.5 years ago. It hasn't done me any harm at all.
Quantitative and meat.
That's big pharma.
I like the way we have Lib Dem MEP contributing actively to Occupy's programme. So this is what you thought was
very well.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
The ambassador has some comments.
Oh, the ambassador was just to come.
Well, first of all, I have to apologize because I will have to leave. And second, two very brief comments. What I think is remarkable and in my mind admirable about the dissent movements in the 1970s and 80s, they were no revolutionaries. They were not very radical by any standard, at least in retrospect. And as a matter of fact, they were quite pragmatic. If you read the opening declaration of the Charter 77, it calls on the government to respect its international obligations under the Helsinki Accords and its own laws. Well, that's a hardly radical program. But admittedly, at the moment, it looked like a very, very radical and very courageous and perhaps impossible thing to achieve, but in the end they did. And my very last remark is just a point of fact. I mean, the difference between Havel and Kundera is that both are wonderful writers, but Kundera is no dissident, he's a cynic and a coward. And what
he lived in Paris.
And what he wrote about, rather dealing with the past than in the future demonstrates that in my